Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Just after midnight, the Prime Minister left for a four-nation, five-day tour of Africa. Today he's in Mozambique, tomorrow South Africa, and then Tanzania and Kenya. This visit follows earlier visits by the President and Vice President, and clearly, therefore, Africa is a major focus for India's foreign policy. So tonight we examine India's relationship with the African continent. How has it changed since independence? What are the key areas of interest? And is India's racist attitude to Africans a challenge we still have to adequately tackle? My guests are two former envoys to Africa, former High Commissioner to Nigeria, HHS Vishwanathan, and former High Commissioner to South Africa, Shiv Mukherjee. The Honorary Fellow from the Centre for Policy Research, Sanjay Baru, the former Director General of the Delhi Policy Group, Radha Kumar, and the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times and the author of India and Africa Towards a New Dawn, Pramitpal Chaudhary. Pramitpal Chaudhary, it's believed that India's relationship with Africa entered a new phase with the first India-Africa summit in 2008. But the relationship actually goes back to the Afro-Asian conferences held in Bandung in 1955. And to be honest, the earlier African Relations Conference in Delhi as far back as 1949. In between, there were periods when Africa and India had serious differences, including the fact that most African countries actually didn't support India against China in '62. Can you briefly sketch out the way this relationship has developed, the different stages it's been through?
Right. Yes, completely. The Afro-Asian Bandung, spirit of Bandung period really dies in 1962 when a lot of African countries and a lot of African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah basically did not support us in 1962 war with China, saying that, you know, your case is not as strong as you make it out to be. We basically withdrew, if you wish, into a bit of a shell after that. And the focus of a lot of our policy in Africa was basically on the anti-apartheid areas up to the 1980s. And I think with liberalization of our economy in 1991, we start to see a real shift on the economic front, particularly the rise of Indian private sector investment in Africa, initially focused on just Nigeria and South Africa and parts of East Africa, but then slowly spreading across the continent. And then, as you said, by the 2008 Indo-Africa Summit, you really see these strands of this new economic relationship really come together with the government institutionalizing the Indo-Africa Summit. And you can actually see the figures for Indian FDI slowly rising from almost zero in 1990s and rising to what they are now of roughly $14 billion. And in the last Indo-Africa Summit last year, which we saw a record turnout, 54 countries coming, we also add a security facet to the relationship which we haven't had so far.
Now, Mr. Vishwanathan, under Nehru and Indira Gandhi, Africa fitted into the non-aligned perspective which was at the very heart of India's foreign policy. But would you accept that starting with Dr. Manmohan Singh, and perhaps even more so under Mr. Modi, Africa has become an area of specific focus in itself, and India's interests in the continent cover a range of subjects from private sector investment to national security, from energy to food security, from education to trade?
Certainly. Till the end of the Cold War, India's relations with Africa were in the framework of the non-aligned movement. Because of both sides, the economic activity was not as strong. But after the opening of the Indian economy, and also the end of the Cold War, Africa came on its own. The ex-colonial powers lost their control or the hold on African countries. The real boom in India-Africa relations started only in the new millennium, when India emerged as a growing economy and the demand for resources from Africa grew. Along with that, we also added the maritime and other security dimensions. So today, it's a totally different qualitative relationship with Africa.
Shiv Mukherjee, let's focus on some of the key areas of this relationship that India has with Africa, and let's begin with Indian private investment. As you heard Pramitpal Chaudhary tell you, it's already 14 billion. And although India's economy is 1/5 the size of China, our private investment is 50% of China's. And I'm told that unlike China, which concentrates primarily on resources and infrastructure, India's investment is far more diverse. It embraces hospitals, education, telecom. and the three biggest companies, I'm told, are Tata, Godrej and Airtel. Is Africa becoming a critical hub for Indian private sector investment?
Well, it is, I don't know how critical, because we started from a very low figure. So, and it's certainly, as Pramit as well as Vishy said, certainly it's a sea change after the Indian economy itself grew. Yeah. I mean, I remember handling in Zambia credits of 10 crores of rupees, I mean, which would be chicken feed today. So certainly the growth of India itself post 1990, 1991, I mean, it would have been inconceivable for us representing India and Africa to think in the 80s, right up to the almost the end of the 80s, of what we are doing now about announcing billion-dollar credits, $4 billion credits, $700 million for a single railway line from Djibouti down to Ivory Coast and so on. That's one. Secondly, Africa itself has changed over the last, I would say, 15 years or so, 15, 20 years. But there are 6 African countries which were till recently the fastest growing economies in the world, starting admittedly from a very small base. But a democracy, economic prudence, growth, these are real stories in Africa today.
So 2 things have happened almost simultaneously. One, India has the capacity to invest in Africa, and Africa is
has
hungry
the capacity to absorb it. Till today, still Africa is locked into a commodity kind of economy. Like the president of Namibia said when he came here, we produce what we do not consume and we consume what we do not produce. But yes, the entire economic landscape in Africa has changed as far as India is concerned.
Sanjay Baru, there are 2 aspects really to India's private investment relationship with Africa. First, there is the investment by Indian companies, which you've just heard Shiv Mukherjee talk about. But the second is the Indian diaspora that lives in Africa, and it's mainly traders and businessmen. Historically, of course, this is a community that's had problems in countries like Kenya, Uganda, even, to be honest, Nigeria. But it's still a huge diaspora. It's 1 million strong in South Africa. It's 80,000 in Kenya, 50,000 in Tanzania. How important is this diaspora as part of India's focus on the continent?
Well, I would imagine it's important, but certainly not as important as, for example, in the Middle East or Gulf. I think India's relationship with Africa, certainly in the last 10-15 years, now stands on its own, independent of the role of the diaspora. Indian companies have gone there on their own, taken people with them. Many of them have had to find their own way. I remember Sunil Mittal telling me that his foray into Africa was almost entirely done by his own company, with very little support from anyone else. But the diaspora exists. I mean, many of them are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Indians. So I'm not sure how sentimental they still feel for India. But I would like to add one aspect to the Indian diaspora, particularly in the 4 countries that Prime Minister Modi is visiting, which are all East African countries, the Indian Ocean East African countries. The Gujarati community has played a particularly important role in many of these countries. And, after all, Gujarat has been the home of the earliest traders going out of India from the Arabian Sea into Africa. So I would imagine that for Prime Minister Modi, this would be an important element in the relationship. And right now in a place like Mozambique, I mean, a lot of Indian companies are increasing their investment there, and certainly Sajjan Jindal, who's known to be close to the Prime Minister, is an important investor in Mozambique.
Radhakumar, moving beyond the investment relationship with Africa, there is a second critical aspect to India's relationship with the continent, and that is to do with security. Each of the 4 countries the Prime Minister is visiting, Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania and Kenya, are Indian Ocean littoral states. I'm told that at the last India-Africa summit, perhaps as many as 15 security agreements were signed with different African countries. As India's naval horizons expand, how central are African countries along the Indian Ocean to India's security interest?
Well, they're absolutely vital to keeping sea lanes free for trade. There was also work required on counter-piracy, though that's higher up the coast. Moreover, I think they share a common interest in preserving plural systems, and they all have sizable populations of diverse religions with whom we also have some common history. So I would say that that would be perhaps one of the more intangible aspects, but perhaps even more critical than the maritime security aspect, where I imagine there will be a great deal of way to go given the differences in the nature, size, operational capacities and strategies of the different navies involved.
Okay. In fact, the interesting thing, Pramit Chaudhary, is within the security perspective, India has a very special relationship with Mozambique,
yes,
the country the Prime Minister is first visiting and where he is as we speak. We play a special role, I'm told, in training their navy, and I'm told that when the African Union Summit was held in Maputo in 2012, Indian naval ships were actually anchored off the coast to provide security.
Yes. That's correct. And in fact, in the second summit too, the World Economic Forum meeting in Maputo, we also had Indian naval ships. And again, anti-piracy since 2012, the Mozambican Channel Indian Navy has been regularly patrolling to keep pirates at Mozambique government's request. And as you mentioned, we now also train their intelligence services. We provide them equipment. And recently we resurrected the Joint Defense Working Group with them. So even on their arming side, we are now beginning to look at training and helping them. So Mozambique now is a country that is an amazing country when you look at from India's perspective. As Dharmendra Pradhan said last year, he said Indian state-owned enterprises in energy, oil and gas have now invested $6 billion in that country. We plan to invest another $6 billion, and that doesn't even incorporate what the Tatas, the Jindals, and everybody else have put in, which is probably about another $1 billion in coal, iron ore, and so on.
Aluminium.
Yeah. And think of this is a country that we may be putting as much as 17 to 18 billion dollars worth of investment. India's cumulative investment in Germany is $6 billion. And this one country we are presenting as our future energy partner in gas and oil, in coal, and as a security partner, almost our aircraft carrier in the southern Indian Ocean.
So the relationship with Mozambique is a unique and special relationship on the continent of Africa between India and them.
It's not unique, but it is special. As Pramit pointed out, the central role there. I saw one of your sister channels pointing to the agreement to import dal as an important thing. I'm afraid the Prime Minister of India does not go to another country just to buy dal. The energy relationship is key. Oil India Limited, as well as the overseas arm of the Oil and Natural Gas Commission, have invested $6 billion over there for future potential development of gas as well as liquefied LNG, liquefied natural gas. Even the coal that we import from Mozambique and the mines that we've invested in are really energy linked because it's coking coal which goes into our power stations, of which we have a shortage. So it is a key relationship. It is based on security, it is based on energy, and it is an extremely friendly country, and I'm extremely glad that right now you have the Prime Minister visiting these 4 countries. Just before this, you had the President visiting Namibia, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast.
And the Vice
President.
President
Just before that, you had the Vice President going to North Africa, which is, I think, an indication, I hope it's sustained, that the neglect that we used to complain about of Indian diplomacy as far as Africa is concerned, and the follow-up that everybody was screaming about after the Africa summit is actually happening.
Coming back, Mr. Vishwanathan, to the security involvement that India has with the African continent, one of the surprising features is that India also has close security involvement with countries in Western Africa, which is the furthest end of the continent from India. For instance, I gather that when Mali in Francophone Africa suffered a virtual insurrection 2 years ago, the French sent in their army, but India committed $100 million for training. Now, you've been High Commissioner in that part of the world. You were High Commissioner in Nigeria. What sort of security links does India have with countries like Ghana and Nigeria?
With Nigeria, for example, we have very old security links. The National Defense Academy in Nigeria was built with Indian assistance. in 1962, if I am not mistaken. And today, the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea is much more than in the Gulf of Aden. And we do get a lot of oil from Nigeria and the Gulf of Guinea, so it is in our interest to upgrade our security arrangements with these countries. We continue to train, of course, the armed personnel in Nigeria, Ghana and other places. Mostly it has been the Anglophone countries, but I am glad that now we are going out and reaching out to Francophone and Lusophone countries. Prime Minister's visit to Mozambique, for example, is very important because it was a Portuguese-speaking country and traditionally we did not have much engagement. So I think in the years to come, our security relations with all these countries will be upgraded because it is also in our interest. And most importantly, you haven't talked about terrorism, maybe you will talk about it later. That is one of the key issues as far as Nigeria, Mali and Guinea are concerned.
Quite right. And as I mentioned a moment ago, India committed $100 million for the training of the Malian security forces after they suffered that virtual insurrection. But very quickly, on the subject of security, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, before I come to other aspects of India's relationship, one of the curious things I've discovered is that India is presently in the process of setting up a security internet-driven telecommunication network so that African leaders can talk to each other without fear of tapping and without fear of eavesdropping. And I gather they chose India rather than any other country to set this up because of the trust they have in us.
Yes, correct. It was something we asked them what would you like us to do given our telecom and IT capacities. And one of the things the African leaders said is we would like to be able to speak to each other in a secure system rather than having to go through other systems. And we now, if I'm correct, about 35 of these countries have now signed up for this. And we are now expanding that network to other countries, to other African countries as they're coming on board on this.
Sanjay Baru, a third aspect of India's developing relationship with Africa, if private sector investment is one, security is a second, is what I would call food security. Before his departure, the Prime Minister's office formally announced that he'd got the cabinet to clear a memorandum of understanding for the import of 1 million tons of pulses from Mozambique. But it's also said that India plans to lease land in countries like Ethiopia and Mozambique to grow pulses and then import them to India. Do you see this aspect of the relationship growing, deepening and widening in the years ahead?
Absolutely. In fact, this is an extremely important aspect of India's emerging geoeconomics with not just Africa but also Latin America. We are a land efficient country on a per capita basis. The land-man ratio in India is adverse to man. While Africa and Latin America are continents which are land surplus, where the land-man ratio is beneficial to man. And therefore there is a perfect synergy between India and Africa and Latin America in terms of our being able to use the land available in those continents for producing food and other natural resources, even minerals and other commodities, which India needs. And therefore, as India grows, as our economic growth is sustained over 8% over the next 2, 3, 4 decades, our demand for these resources will only increase, food and other commodities. So this is a very critical relationship which will become even more important.
Radhakumar, a fourth aspect of the relationship with Africa is, I gather, energy. Now, I'm told that something like 50 out of Africa's 54, 55 countries export some quantity of oil and gas. Secondly, I'm also told that with the exception of a few West Asian countries, the oil and gas prices from Africa are far cheaper and more favorable for India than they are from anywhere else. How do you see the energy relationship developing?
It's been in our interest to diversify our sources of energy import for a long time. And indeed, our government, both the previous and the present one, have worked on this for quite some time. I'm not familiar with the economics of transport versus lower prices, but presumably both would have to be factored in. as far as I understand it, our needs and our demands are so very large that whether we reduce our dependency on West Asian supplies or not, we would still need substantial supplies from Africa, from Central Asia, if we can get them, from Russia.
You know, I bear in mind the point that Radha Kumar made about the different economics of cost versus transport. But keeping that in mind, Mozambique is, I gather, the third largest exporter of natural gas after Qatar and Australia. Could Mozambican gas possibly replace projects such as the India-Pakistan pipeline and TAPI, which have been talked about but seem to be stuck?
Well, my opinion is that it not. I don't know about the quantities involved, because frankly, I distrust the kind of figures with lots of zeros after them that are thrown around by experts. But the fact is that TAPI is not going to happen. And the fact is that Mozambique has natural gas, where we've actually invested money, and it's not only can happen, it is actually happening. So while we need not ignore the possibilities of TAPI, I think we should pursue the Mozambican channel, vigorously, because you have, I mean, if you just look at the map, it's a direct straight line from the port of Beira to Mumbai. Yeah. You have a friendly government who will obviously give us at least as favorable terms as anywhere else.
So there's huge potential here.
Absolutely.
Now, Prabhupada, let me come to the fifth dimension. For the sake of the audience, I'll repeat, we've talked about private sector investment, national security, food security, and energy, but the fifth is to do with education. I gather India has set up one of the biggest open university networks for online distance learning, which is based in Senegal, but covers some 40 out of Africa's 55 countries. And oddly enough, its greatest sphere of influence is right at the other end of the continent in Ethiopia. Yeah. Tell me more about this.
Yes, the Indira Gandhi National Open National University, the system that we had set up, when African countries began to look at how they could handle their educational problems, this was an obvious thing, especially in a continent so large and so lacking in infrastructure. It had exactly the same problems in many ways that India had already faced or was facing. So we began to set up, they requested us to set up an open university as well. So distance learning, which would be the technical term for it, is now one of our biggest sources of soft power, if you wish. We do it on a number of levels. We do the distance learning. We also have the so-called iTech program, in which we train Africans in specialized subjects like irrigation and agriculture and so on. And I've forgotten how many, but I think about 10,000 a year graduates come out of India from this. And now there's a large number of Africans in very key positions all across the continent who have Indian training and knowledge. And now we're trying to actually set up training institutes in Africa itself, modeled on some of what we have done in India. And so across the board, we're being seen that Africa now has a middle class of about 100 million people, not too dissimilar from what we have. And that group is now looking upon India as one of the alternatives to where they can get education and knowledge, not just the normal case of Europe and the United States as was before.
Mr. Vishwanathan, I suppose an illustration of all that we've talked about so far, of the nature of the relationship India has with Africa, as well as the depth to which that relationship can go and its prospects for the future, is the case of South Sudan, the newest African country. I believe South Sudan is dominated by Indian trucks and Indian cell phone companies. Their leadership, almost to a man, comes to India for their health problems. And the trade is dominated by Ugandan Indians, who are all, of course, part of India's diaspora in Africa. The country itself is the size of France, but with a population of barely 8 million and masses of arable land, and so great potential for growing food. Do you see this country as a sort of illustrative example of the extent to which India's influence, India's role, India's relationship in Africa can go?
Certainly. But unfortunately, South Sudan is going through a lot of internal conflicts. So unless that is settled, we would not be able to carry forward our cooperation to much higher levels. But I would like to come back to the question of education, which you talked about just now. Apart from university education, both primary and secondary education have a great potential in Africa. Most of the African countries do not have good schools, and Indian private schools can play a great role where there is a win-win situation.
So you mean to say that the DPSs and the modern schools and all of those have an export potential as well?
Certainly. Some of them have already started, and it would be greatly appreciated in Africa, because the African lower and upper middle class, they don't have any schools to send their children to. There is a huge demand for not even high quality but even medium quality schools in most of the countries.
That's wonderful. It's almost ironic that whilst we send our children to Europe and America for education, at the same time we can export our schools to Africa to help them. Let's take a break at that point and come back and turn to the other side of this discussion. To what extent is India's racist attitude and treatment of Africans when they come to India a major challenge and possibly a major stumbling block in the growth of this critical relationship? And to what extent is that something that will be at the back of the Prime Minister's mind, and maybe something on which he'll be formally questioned by the heads of government he's in Africa? We'll come back to that second important part of this discussion immediately after this break. Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and we're discussing the Prime Minister's 4-nation, 5-day trip to Africa that began this morning. Shiv Mukherjee, let's come to what could be, I suppose, the biggest problem in India's outreach to Africa, the way we treat Africans in India. How serious a sore point is this in the relationship?
You know, I've lived in Africa for 10 years. I've lived with them in southern Africa, seen their reactions, seen the interplay between the black, white and browns. And of course, being an Indian, one sees not just racism, the racism that pervades Indians, but how it plays out with the Africans who come here. Yes, it is a problem, but I don't think it's an insuperable problem. I think it can be tackled. It has not yet created the kind of crisis that some people think it could. For instance, I mean, if you just take students, Delhi University, I read, has received 5 times as many applicants. The number of applicants from Africa are 5 times as many as last year. Now, obviously, the racist incidents that the entire, the Africa group among the ambassadors here have complained about officially to the Ministry of External Affairs has not really affected that. There is no doubt that there is a problem, that Indians in India and behind the scenes, sometimes open, sometimes mostly hidden, there's a racist backdrop to the relationship between the Indian community and the blacks in Africa. I don't think it's an insuperable problem. By and large, the Indian community in most of the East African and Southern Africa with which I'm familiar have also had an honorable record in the liberation struggles and so on. Part of the racist thing is also due to the envy of the prosperity of the brown community. It is a problem. We are racist in our attitudes, but I don't think it's something that can't be tackled.
Well, how it's tackled depends upon, first of all, Mr. Vishwanathan, whether we admit it, because if we don't admit it, we won't begin to tackle it. Now, like you, I've lived in Nigeria too, although unfortunately 2 decades earlier. My clear impression is that Africans often look upon Indians as more racist than the whites. Firstly, because we lack the discretion to hide it, and secondly, because as traders and businessmen, our interface with them is often more direct than it is in the case of the whites. Would you accept that that's an impression that lingers today in Nigeria, or has it changed?
It lingers to a certain extent, but the enlightened Nigerians feel that the racist attitude is not institutionalized in India. But they do feel that Indians are very color conscious. And that we can see even in India. The foreigners keep watching your television and the advertisements, where India probably is the only country where, leave alone women, even men use whitening creams, and celebrities actually endorse these products. So these the foreigners watch. That is the impression they get. But only the extreme cases of racism come to light in India. Like somebody is beaten up or somebody is killed. But what about the numerous incidents of racial slights and insults
Quite right.
that the Africans face on a day-to-day basis?
And those hurt much more.
In my view, the basic problem is the awareness about Africa. Where is Africa, African geography and African history in our school and college curricula?
Yes,
it's not there.
Unfortunately, Mr. Vishwanathan, ignorance cannot be an excuse for racism, although it might be a possible explanation for it, but racism is reprehensible regardless of whether you're knowledgeable or not. Pramit Chaudhary, Sushma Swaraj.
I have just one more point.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Even the enlightened and educated Indians, I have spent 10 years in West Africa, like Shiv Shankar has spent 10 years in East Africa. I have seen that even enlightened Indians, when they talk to Africans, and that too not to common Africans, but ministers and intellectuals in Africa, there is a kind of a patronizing and condescending attitude when they talk to them.
Absolutely. And that draws into question the adjective you use to describe them when you call them enlightened. Their behavior suggests they're anything but enlightened. But Pramit Chaudhary, recently, Sushma Swaraj said that the problem was not racist, that India is not racist in its attitude to Africans. So she said this publicly and repeatedly at her press conference. Do you accept the point she's making, or is this in fact a sign of denial that makes the problem worse, because it suggests if you don't recognize it, you're not going to do anything near enough to tackle it?
Absolutely. I think it was an act of denial. No African believed her statement. And any African you meet in India, whether a student or a medical tourist, will tell you that they do. They get yelled at. People yell at them, Hapshi, just for no reason at all. And as Mr. Vishwanathan mentioned, they face minor racist. There is racism very clearly in India, and unfortunately, I thought the foreign minister made a big mistake in not acknowledging this, because this was an opportunity for the political leadership of India to tell its people that, look, this is something that you have to recognize is bad. In the same way that the West took about 100 years to do the same, that you can't use the N-word anymore, and that you can't, at least, it should not be publicly acceptable to do some of this stuff, especially at the public level. Right now, Indians don't have much interaction with Africans in India, but that's now growing. 30,000 African students, 40 or 50,000 African medical tourists, presumably more and more businessmen. That interaction is spreading. The government needs to start preempting what are going to be bad racist incidents, or even small and rampant racist incidents, when this interaction starts to expand.
Now, Sanjay Baru, I noticed when the spate of racist incidents happened in Delhi, in Hyderabad, Bangalore recently, the Malian Ambassador in India, who is the doyen of the African Diplomatic Corps, gave a very outspoken interview to the BBC, and he was very critical about India's attitude and the way in which Africans were treated. Do you believe this issue will be brought to Mr. Modi's direct attention by the interlocutors, the heads of government he's going to meet in Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya and South Africa?
Well, I don't know if they will actually bring it up with him directly, but they have certainly brought it up as you know, the diplomats in Delhi of many of these African countries made a point to raise the issue when there was recently an incident of I think a murder. I think Prime Minister Modi understands the problem, but as somebody else just said, I think Pramit and others have said, we should talk about the problem. I had a classmate from Africa when I was a student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University 40 years ago. There was no racism on the JNU campus at that time. It was a very progressive campus, and therefore the attitudes were very different. On the other hand, about 25 years ago, I was a teacher at a university in Hyderabad, and I had African students, and they used to complain about racism in the campus. I used to have these long conversations with my African students. So I think it depends on what social group in India we are talking about, which part of India we are talking about. But it is a problem, and I don't think it would be raised at heads of government level, but it's certainly been raised at the diplomatic level. And we need to, as a country, particularly the media, I think forget about what the government says and does. We in the media ought to make this an issue and ought to focus on attitudes, as somebody said, you know, about fair skin. I mean, this is an Indian problem. It's not about just Africans, you know, running. All our good-looking stars on cinema are fair-skinned women. I mean, very rarely do you see a dark-skinned person who's a popular star.
Radhakumar, if India is unable to tackle...
Except Rajnikant.
Radhakumar, if India is unable to tackle, restrain and reverse the racism that confronts Africans when they come to this country, could that curb, perhaps even damage the prospects for the relationship we hope to build with the continent? After all, remember, all the African students who come here will go back with those horrible memories of how they were treated and how they were humiliated by Indians.
Well, 2 points to start off with. Of course, people who face racism will go back with terrible memories. But we should remember that Africans, very sadly, face racism in probably 90% of the world. And their experiences of racism are therefore very dire, and it may be that they are willing to give us a little tolerance because of that experience, which would be a great act of generosity on their part. The second point to make about India is that it isn't just Africans who face racism here. Indians face racism in different parts of the country. And there's a huge debate about whether that should or should not be recognized as racism. Indeed, one of the profound ironies is that the much fairer skinned people of the Northeast face racism in Delhi.
Except that that's a different issue. Radhika, come back to Africa. Coming back to Africa,
2 or 3 points. One, that the violent incidents that we have seen happening over the past couple of years in Delhi, for example, but also in Bangalore, also in other parts of metropolitan India, are very likely going to rise, and there definitely needs to be preventive action taken, both in terms of speech and change of consciousness, but also in terms of policing and action, which is, okay, a wider issue for the people of India at large. It's also a huge issue for foreigners and Africans in this country. And finally, I would say that, you know, Prime Minister Modi has an opportunity in this visit to actually speak about how his government wants to change the attitude within India. So why doesn't, you know, instead of asking whether they will raise it, he should raise it.
All right, Radha, maybe in fact he may just do that. The Prime Minister often surprises us because he often takes an issue literally by the horns, and he may well choose to do so. And in this instance, who knows, it might be the right way of tackling the problem. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye.